Thanks, William. I'm delighted to introduce today Professor Jonas Nahm. As you can see from the slide, he's an assistant professor of energy, environment, and resources at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, also known as SAIS. Jonas is already an accomplished scholar in the area of environmental studies, globalization, political economy, manufacturing, and has a book project that looks at the rise of wind and solar technologies in China, Germany, and the United States. He's also the author of several impressive articles, including in outstanding places like Science, the Review of International Political Economy, Governance. He had his undergraduate degree in Cambridge in the UK. He's a native of Germany, and then did his PhD at MIT. As you can see, the title of his talk today, provocative title, Will China Save the World on Climate? Please join me in welcoming to BYU Dr. Jonas Nahm.
Thank you all for coming and for inviting me to speak here. It's my first time in Utah, so I'm excited to hit the slopes tomorrow and do this little talk before then. So I'm going to talk about China's role in making the climate problem today, but also sort of China's role in fixing it. But before I break into that, I thought I could give you a little bit of sort of a feel for the scale of development in China over the last 40 years. So this is traffic in Beijing the year I was born. And so this is traffic in Beijing last year during the Chinese National Day. This is the subway map of Beijing in 2004 when I first went there to study Chinese. So there were 3 subway lines, and this is today. So you can sort of see that there's this incredible pace of development. This is the Shanghai skyline. There isn't a skyline in 1987, and then this is a couple of years ago. It's changed already again, right? So you can sort of see that there's this incredible pace of development, which of course has brought great prosperity to big parts of the population, but it has also contributed to enormous and rapid rise in China's contribution to the carbon problem, right? So China now is by far the largest emitter of CO2. And so there's a sort of constant battle in the media, kind of gloom and doom reporting over whether China will, make it impossible to fix the climate problem, or whether China will be the leader, especially since the US announced that it would pull out of the Paris Accords. There's been a lot of debate about whether China can be sort of the next global leader on climate policy. And so what I want to do today is kind of go through some of this contradictory reporting, because if you look at the news and you try to figure out whether China will actually save the world on climate, the evidence is fairly mixed. So on the one hand, China is now the largest market by far for wind energy. It's also the largest producer of wind turbines. It's the largest maker of solar panels in the world, and this is despite us slapping tariffs on Chinese solar panels and some of the industry moving elsewhere. They're still making almost 2/3 of the solar panels in the world. And in a really sharp contrast to maybe 10 or 15 years ago, when China was mostly just making these things to sell them to other countries, China is now also using solar. It's the largest market domestically for solar PV. And then much to the chagrin of the American and the German auto companies that have long made much of their money selling cars to this growing middle class in China, China has now announced that it wants to switch to electric vehicles and has pushed automakers around the world to invest billions in investment on batteries and electric vehicle technology. But despite all of these sort of impressive achievements and this determined effort to try to switch to clean energy technologies in China, we constantly get terrible news out of China as well. So more than 70% of power in China still comes from coal, for instance, and that hasn't really budged in recent years. And part of that has been this incredible air pollution crisis that has gripped the country for the last 10 years or so that no one's been able to fix. And so you see pictures like this on Chinese social media, which in itself is kind of a novel phenomenon because censorship in China is pretty tight. And in the past, there's been a lot of kind of repression of this kind of public discussion of these problems. But the air pollution crisis is now so great that the government can't ignore it. And so it's basically just given in and people are talking and reporting it. And so what I want to do in the next half hour, or hopefully a little bit less than that, is give you sort of an analytical lens or a framework to try to understand these different outcomes, or these kind of contradictory, the climate paradox in China, essentially. And hidden in there is a secret pitch that political science has something to contribute to real-world problems or our understanding of real-world problems. And so the argument that I'm trying to make is that we often think of authoritarian governments as these monolithic actors, right? That this is one state, there's no elections, and so they should be able to fix the climate problem if they want to. But if you actually start looking at who has interests within the Chinese state, it's actually very fragmented. There's lots of different parts of the government with very different interests. And if we understand those different interests, then we can suddenly see why we get such contradictory reporting out of China, because it actually is caused by very different parts of the Chinese state. And so I'll talk through in very practical terms some of the examples of how this works on the ground, but I'll spend maybe 2 or 3 minutes on explaining sort of how the Chinese state works. And so basically, if we think of the climate problem, it's a problem of vested interests, right? So there are lots of people invested in the status quo that have coal power plants, that own oil refineries, that don't want to switch to clean sources of energy. And so it's a problem of state capacity. How do we deal with these interest groups? And so how strong are we vis-a-vis these interest groups? And so in China, there's different parts of the government that are on both sides of this divide. There are those invested in the status quo, and there are those that are trying to push for clean energy policy, for climate policy, and so on. And so if we look at the central government alone, these are just all the ministries in Beijing that are tasked with something related to energy, right? There's many of them. And so if you are owning the national oil companies, you obviously have very different views on climate than if you're the Environmental Protection Agency. And so these different players have different tools, different resources, different amounts of money to fight their fight and kind of push for their interests. And then to make things more complicated, China has several layers of government below the center, and all those layers have different kind of objectives in this fight as well. And so local governments in particular in China are very dependent on economic growth. They're required to pay for all sorts of things, healthcare, education. Their promotion, government officials' promotion, is dependent on local GDP figures. And so they really need to grow the economy in order to be successful. That's their main incentive. And we did that, or China did that, deliberately in the 1980s in order to create incentives for economic growth. But so local governments are keenly aware of whether a policy will hurt or help local GDP growth, and will always prioritize growth over the environment. The central government might push these ambitious policies, but it has to push them past these local actors that are often asked to implement them. And so we get very ambitious policies at the national level. China basically, at the same time as many of the European countries, enacted very ambitious renewable energy targets. It's now by far the largest investor in these technologies. So if you look at this, there's one button that apparently will blow up the building, so I'm trying not to hit that. But so if you look at these targets for this year that China's trying to reach, basically it's trying to build 100 nuclear power plants worth of solar, 200 nuclear power plants worth of wind, right? This is an installation, basically the entire European electric grid just in wind and solar in China. So, and they're doing it, it's actually happening. And local governments are actually very helpful in this fight as long as it aligns with their economic interests. This is one of these industrial zones that dot the Chinese landscape. Every city has many of them. That's where all of the factories are usually located. And in China, it's not a real industrial zone unless you have one of these signs. And you have to have a model with lights that they can turn on for visitors. And so local governments are invested in this process when it helps them grow the local economy. So they've been very keen to install wind turbines because that brings money into the local economy. You have to build these things, maintain these things. And so that helped local GDP growth. And so when the center said we want to reach these targets, local governments were on board very quickly, and so then surpassed relatively rapidly the United States in terms of the biggest market for wind power in the world. Local governments in China have also lent a lot of money to renewable energy companies because manufacturing is great, right? You give someone money to build a plant, it starts contributing to GDP right then, even before the plant's even open, right? The investment itself is counted in local statistics. And so even after the financial crisis in 2008, Chinese solar companies were able to raise billions of dollars for expansion of new factories and investment in manufacturing. And so what we got was an incredible scale-up of this global production of wind and solar because of China. So I think in the United States, there's often this myth that somehow China stole the world's solar industry, but it actually was a Chinese invention to even make solar PV at that scale. So if you see, before Chinese firms entered, these were kind of cottage industries. They weren't really full-blown industrial sectors. And it was the money that local governments were willing to lend to these new industries that allowed them to scale up to that degree. And so what Chinese firms did is invest in manufacturing because nobody else had been able to figure it out. I don't know if anyone has ever driven on that highway between Palm Springs and Los Angeles, and you sort of go through this incredible valley with tons of wind turbine installations and then lots of kind of broken wind turbines on the ground. And so what happened there was in the 90s, this was a very unproven technology. We hadn't really figured out manufacturing, right? So these things were blowing up and setting on fire, and so this was very experimental. And then China set out basically to fix that problem and did that for the world. It's a Chinese innovation to mass produce wind turbines and solar panels that actually work. And they often did that in collaboration with firms from around the world. So this is not a zero-sum game. And so if we look at these cost declines and all the technologies that we need to fix the climate problem, most of them are now being made in China, and most of the cost declines are attributable to scale economies, essentially, and all the innovation related to that. And so what could go wrong, right? So we have local governments on board, we have the central government pushing these things. Why am I even giving this talk? And so the sort of dark side of this is that wherever it suits local governments to support dirty industries, they also do that. They're completely agnostic. And so it's basically just kind of an economic game. And so if we look, for instance, at the construction of coal power plants, you see that whenever the coal price falls, you get this uptick in local construction of polluting coal power plants because local governments figure that they can make money with these plants. And then in this administrative structure where you have all of these ministries in Beijing, and then you have all of these layers of government underneath, there are a lot of coordination problems that are not really worked out that also don't help. So for one, in the United States, we have what we call a dispatch order. Now, I'm getting a little technical, but hopefully not too much. In the US, whoever makes the cheapest power gets first dibs on the grid, right? So if there's power demand and you are the cheapest source of power at that moment, you go first. China doesn't have that kind of system. And it's a political system, and basically local governments get to just decide who goes first. And because they have just invested in all of these coal power plants as well, you can see where they're going to go, right? They'll create demand for their own coal power plants. And so often renewable energy doesn't actually get to feed its power into the grid. To make matters worse, we have really poor coordination in terms of building out the power grid. It's an American problem too. If you're trying to build a power line from Chicago to California, there's lots of administrative battles along the way as everyone tries to avoid power lines in their backyard. But in China, we have the problem that local governments get to approve where the wind parks are being built, and the central government gets to approve where the power lines are. And so sometimes you don't have power lines where you have wind parks. So we get all of this investment, but then it's not being used very efficiently. And so we have this kind of coordination problem in the power sector. And so we have great investments in all of these new power lines, even from the interior, but they're not necessarily in the interior exactly where we need them to be. And to make matters worse, provincial governors get to decide how much power they trade with each other. So in most countries, we have a power market, and basically the grid is just the grid. But in China, we have all of these different provinces that I don't think you can see very well here, and we have very low rates of trade of power between these provinces. And that's obvious, right? Because if you are dependent on local economic growth for promotion, for paying for schools, you're going to try to use your own power. You don't want to buy these guys' power. And this is where all the wind resources are and all the solar, and here's where all the energy consumption is. And so we could theoretically use this infrastructure to trade, but what we're doing instead is just having these sit empty while we fire up our local coal power plants in order to create local economic growth at the moment. And so what we get in China is what we call curtailment. And so this is, for 2015, the rate of power for different provinces that just went to waste. So we got a lot of wind and solar power that they couldn't sell to anyone because no one would buy it from them because they were trying to use local power, essentially. And so I showed you this graph earlier, how China is surpassing the United States in installed capacity for wind turbines. But if you look at how much energy they actually produce with this capacity, they're still behind the US in terms of overall wind energy, even though they have multiple times the amount of wind turbines. And that's in large part because they can't always sell the power that they're making. The central government is not oblivious to this problem. And so under Xi Jinping, there's been a big push to centralize this system, this sort of chaos, bring in the local governments, make it more structured, and allow the center to more effectively set policy. And so one thing that they've done in Beijing is just consolidate some of the functions related to different aspects of climate and energy policy. And so we have a new Ministry of Ecology and Environment now that has taken all of the climate-related functions from different other ministries in order to make this more effective. And hopefully it'll be a stronger ministry so it can stand up to some of the oil interests as well in the central government. So there's a real effort to change the structure. And then they've also installed these, I call them spying agencies. So this might be a confusing graph, but basically you have these different levels of government, and then for the Ministry of Environment, there's also a provincial version and a municipal version. And in principle, these guys are supposed to report back up and over, right? So if there's a guideline that comes out of Beijing, the local guy needs to report to the provincial guy what they've done, and then to the central guy, and report over. The problem with this is that these guys are always in the same place and they're all friends with each other, right? So in practice, the local Ministry of Environment is much more beholden to the local municipal government or the provincial government, and these guys are not so interested in the environment sometimes, right? And so we've had a lot of lack of enforcement, essentially, of good policy because the local versions of these central agencies are actually sort of in bed with the local government. And what the central government is now doing, it's installing these spy agencies essentially to report back on what their agencies are doing in order to try to get this hierarchy reinforced. And so that's a real attempt to kind of solve some of these problems. We now have caps on coal power installations, so the central government has basically forced some local governments to shut down construction of new coal power in order to fix this problem. And I don't know if you've seen some of the news reporting around it, but China's also launched what's going to be the largest emissions trading system in the world. So basically a carbon market where everyone gets allocated a certain amount of credits. So these are emissions you can produce, and if you go over, you have to buy more credits from others that didn't use theirs. And so it's a way to price pollution, essentially, and hopefully create incentives create some incentives for better enforcement. The problem with all of these reforms is that local governments can't shake old habits, even in this new system. And so we have this incredibly stubborn persistence of this local priority or sort of prioritization of economic growth. And so we started these pilots for these carbon markets in different parts of the country, and everyone was very hopeful. All of these different industrial sectors were supposed to be included. There was a lot of push to really make this a comprehensive way of taxing pollution and fix both the air pollution problem and China's emissions problem. But state-owned enterprises, so basically all of the local and central businesses that are owned directly by the government, including most of the coal power sector, started lobbying for exemptions. And so what we got is not too dissimilar from what we got in the European Union, where we also have sort of a bad carbon trading system, or in the United States, where we tried to pass one and it failed in Congress. So we got a very watered down version. For many sectors were exempted. Many sectors got too many credits, so they didn't actually have to change behavior, right? So if I give you more carbon credits than you're actually normally emitting every year, you don't have to do anything. We have a great carbon trading system for your sector, but you don't change behavior. And then local governments pushed for what they called flexible caps. So if you actually run up against your limit and you're supposed to buy more, they just give you more. And so that's sort of a really bad way of enforcing any kind of discipline, right? And so we've had this incredible attempt, but it's being submerged by, or sort of essentially hijacked by the same forces that we were trying to combat in these reforms. I've done a lot of work recently on electric vehicles in China. I think it's a really fascinating area. China now controls something like 70% of the world's battery manufacturing for electric vehicles. It's forcing all of the companies that are selling cars in China to sell a certain percentage of their fleet as electric vehicles. And so it's really actually modeled this on a California law that's been in place there for a long time. And so we had a lot of pilot cities kind of trying out this new legislation, giving incentives for public investment in infrastructure, so charging stations. In many places, the taxi fleet has to be completely electric, and the buses are electric now, which is kind of amazing. How many of you have been to China in recent, maybe not super recently, not a great place to go right now, but a few. If you go to, some of the cities that have implemented this, it's impressive because it's so quiet. The traffic is really changing because you don't hear electric cars in the same way, and the buses are completely silent. And so it's changing sort of the way that people perceive the city. So in many ways, this is working. One of the key ways that governments at the local level are trying to incentivize the purchase of electric cars to make you buy a license plate. And so if you buy a regular license plate, there are long wait lines and it's very expensive. If you buy a license plate for an electric vehicle, you get it within a couple of weeks. And so it's just purely the sort of time and money incentive that people, even if they don't want an electric car, they'll buy one anyway because it helps them get the car on the road very quickly. Now, the problem here is that every Chinese city now wants to be a manufacturing location for electric vehicles. And so they have found all sorts of ways to discriminate against electric vehicles from other cities. So if you want to get an electric vehicle and you want that license plate in Shanghai, you better buy a car that's either made in Shanghai or that has a battery that's made in Shanghai, because otherwise you might still get on the long list and it'll take longer for you to get the electric car. Or you get certain kinds of tax breaks that are only really given out if you buy a locally made car. And so what could be the world's biggest market essentially for electric vehicles, where we should see 2 or 3 or 4 companies emerge as real global competitive firms, is incredibly fragmented, and everyone is spending a lot of time trying to maneuver this sort of bureaucratic chaos of how to navigate these rules from the government. And I was in early January, before all of this broke out, I was visiting battery companies in China, and they were saying that they're building all of these factories in places they wouldn't otherwise build a factory, because otherwise their customers can't sell the cars in those cities. And so where you could get these economies of scale that helped us bring down the cost of wind and solar, we're having a really hard time getting that, because local governments are falling back on old instincts and kind of interfering with the system in order to shore up local economic growth. And so as everyone's also channeling more money into these local sectors, one big danger is that we get overcapacity, and we'll have all of these battery factories in all of these cities, and no one will actually be able to get electric vehicles down to the price where we don't need to use all sorts of incentives to convince people to buy them. But I would say local governments aren't the only ones to blame for this sort of ongoing problem here. They certainly haven't changed their incentives, and they will always push economic growth if they can. But the center continues to be fragmented despite these different reforms. And so national oil companies, the national electric grid, these are big, powerful players. The national electric grid company in China supplies power to 1 billion households. The scale of this is incredible. So they have a lot of resources to stay in this fight and fight for their interests, and they don't always align very well with these climate objectives. And so the center hasn't quite fixed its own incentive structure in a way that would help us make climate a priority. Climate is also not always a priority in the central government when it comes to its international role. I don't know how many of you have heard of the Belt and Road Initiative. It's this big program in China where the government is essentially trying to sort of recreate the Silk Road and create outward investment of Chinese companies all over the world, and mostly in developing countries, but now even in Italy and sort of other European nations. And so we were all hoping in the climate field that there would be sort of a green investment policy attached to this, that money lending from banks to companies to go abroad and sell their products abroad would be tied to some sort of environmental standard. And that hasn't really happened. What has happened is that the government is using the Belt and Road to create export markets for sectors that have overcapacity domestically. And ironically, whenever they're now clamping down on the construction of new coal power plants domestically, there's more incentives to export these coal power plants to Vietnam, to Uganda, to Kenya. And so while we might be addressing some of these problems domestically through this mechanism, we then are just exporting the problem somewhere else. So that's not really helping us. Globally, China is saying, well, if Vietnam wants to buy coal power, who are we to tell them what they should buy? But it is, on this scale, a problem that we need to solve collectively. And then finally, I think China also, the center doesn't always know what's best. So there is a sort of assumption that if we give more power to the center, we can kind of overcome of these structural incentives that are working against us at the local level. But Beijing is not necessarily always fully aware. And they also have a very kind of nationalistic view of how this works. I showed you earlier the slide of all of these different companies working with Chinese firms on development of wind and solar, and sort of this global system really of tech development in these sectors. Beijing wants all of these things to happen in China, and so it's giving a lot of incentives to sort of pull things into China that maybe won't help us make this cheaper and faster and cleaner for the world. And so in some way, for us to buy Chinese solar panels, we also politically have to show that we have something to gain from this, right? And so if we're shutting out California tech developers from Chinese markets in these industries, it sort of backfires for Chinese export markets over time. But Beijing is sort of very instinctively always pulling things to China and creating all sorts of incentives for companies to invest locally, to pull factories to China. And so I think this sort of nationalistic view, this sort of techno-nationalistic view in Beijing is also not helping. Now, I don't want to talk for too long, but maybe sort of some broad lessons to draw from this. I showed you that there are different interests within the Chinese government, that a lot of parts of the Chinese government have really good environmental intentions and set really strong targets on climate and clean energy. I also showed you that many other parts of the Chinese government are really dependent on economic growth. And so where clean energy, environment, climate, and growth align, China is unstoppable, right? But where it contradicts each other, then often the dirty side wins out. And I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. I also tried to make the point that centralization isn't a silver bullet. I mean, if we just sort of shut down all of the power of local governments in China, it wouldn't really help us because the center may not necessarily know always what to do. And sometimes this sort of chaos of central and local policy making can actually be really helpful. No one decided that China should invest in wind and solar in 2003. This wasn't a central government policy. These were local governments who were thinking, oh, these sound like cool industry, let's give them some money and do this, right? So this was really a bottom-up initiative. And so sometimes this sort of loose system of experimentation, of lack of enforcement can actually yield surprising outcomes, and outcomes that are much better than the alternative. So China didn't follow the sort of very organized development model, say, of Japan or Korea, but for wind and solar, that's exactly what worked. The kind of chaos at the local level, the ability to lend to local firms, that's what made these industries successful globally. And so in all of this chaos, I think sometimes there's some real innovation that comes out of these structures. So I asked this question at the beginning of the talk, and I didn't really answer it, I guess, but I'll sort of make some predictions. I think whether China will save the world or not depends a lot on the rest of us. I think our current policy towards China is incredibly confrontational and very sort of zero-sum. The trade war is a great example of that, right? So it's how much do you export, how much do we export, and it's all measured in terms of what do you give us, what do they take. If we want China to do well on climate, we need to allow it to do well economically in these sectors. If China can export solar panels, it's going to be all in on the fight. It sees the global climate agreement as a way to create markets for these technologies. And if you really think about how much time we have to solve the climate problem, if you really want to turn emissions around in the next 10 years, it's also very unlikely that anyone else will be able to replicate this Chinese manufacturing system in that short of a time span. And so working with China and figuring out how China can gain economically from investing in these industries will bring it on board and will actually incentivize it to take that leadership position globally on these environmental and climate agreements. I think if we are pushing this sort of nationalist agenda where we all try to do our own thing, where we don't collaborate, and where China can also not win in these sectors, it's very quick to turn away. I think a lot of the uncertainty economically during the trade negotiations recently has actually strengthened the hardliners in the Chinese government who said, why are we investing in all of this new stuff? We have a lot of coal. That's the only thing we have domestically, actually, is sort of really dirty coal. Let's bring coal back because that's safe, that's tried, that's true, and maybe this whole global solar industry won't work out. And so I think we can incentivize China to do the right thing, but it'll take some help from the rest of the world in order to get us there. And on this note, I hope you have some questions for me, and we can have a discussion. And I'm happy to elaborate. I sort of rushed you through 15 years of research on all aspects of China's energy sector. I'm happy to dive deep or talk about things that I haven't talked about. I think this framework, sort of this incentive framework, applies to other parts of the Chinese economy. So whether you talk environmental law or sort of environmental protection or even labor law, the incentives of local governments are always very similar to what I outlined here. So hopefully this can give you a template. And then the last thing that I'll say is that I hope the next time you open the newspaper and you see sort of China will kill us and it'll save us on the same page, literally in the Financial Times, if you go through and you actually figure out who are the actors that get to control these outcomes, all of a sudden it makes a lot of sense, right? You can kind of trace it back to who owns what, who has economic incentives to participate on these both sides. And so in many ways, it's actually not contradictory. It's just people very logically responding to the incentives that are being set for them by the Chinese state. Thank you.
Lecture. We do have some time for questions. We'll ask you to come to the microphone here. We're filming this, so we want to hear your question as well as the response. Please tell us your name, what you're studying, and then your question. So please.
Hi.
Hi.
I'm Mary Curtis, and I'm majoring in public health with an emphasis in health promotion. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how the national carbon market encompasses global emissions.
So it won't encompass anything outside of China, right?
Okay.
So it'll be a domestic market, but it still has a global impact. I mean, if you think about one of the things that China always complains about in the climate world is that half of China's emissions are actually not for things that China is using. They're emissions for things we buy at Walmart. And so should these emissions be counted on our account or on their account, right? So what they're trying to do is basically control emissions from all of these industrial sectors and create incentives to lower them. But in a way, those are also emissions that we are directly responsible for, right? Because the plastic for this plastic bottle probably was made somewhere in a Chinese factory, and so I'm part of that problem every single day, right? So it's hard to kind of disentangle these things, I think.
My name's Noah Valentine. I'm a physiology major, and I'm just curious, where do you see China in 30 or 40 years? What is climate change, and what are how are recent developments, I guess, going to impact the near future? That's my question.
I mean, I think China is incredibly exposed to climate change already. So there's very little water in the Chinese north, where most of the population is today. Beijing is now has a population cap because it doesn't have enough water. It's in the middle of the desert. Climate change is making it drier. And over the past 20 years, the Chinese government has built the largest water transfer system from the south to the north. It's this incredible, Google it, it's an incredible structure of these canals that are pumping water thousands of miles to basically get water to Beijing. The problem with that is, for instance, that the reservoir where all that water is coming from is fed by glaciers in the Himalayas that are melting by the minute, right? And so I think there's a kind of pragmatic approach here that eventually they'll have to solve this problem because they're really on the line themselves. And so so I think they'll come around. It's just a question of whether they can solve these sort of internal problems, because the local governments along the way don't care so much about what Beijing is doing and where the water's coming from. They care about whether they can put, food on the table and get their next job. And so I think in some ways these struggles are actually not so different from the struggles that we're facing here in sort of an election year where everyone's saying, well, what's the minimum wage, but I need a job, and like, how do we protect this, and is this going to make energy more expensive, and so on. I think that's a very kind of universal system. China's advantage in all of this is that ultimately it has a lot to gain from a global effort to do this, right? It makes all the wind turbines, the solar panels, the batteries, so, there's a sort of, there's an economic incentive there nationally to eventually, become a forceful player. So I'm hopeful that that'll do that in the long run. In these climate negotiations globally, you see right now that it's a really new player on the global scene, and it's a little clumsy sometimes. The negotiation is a little clumsy. It doesn't, so, I think they also are facing a steep learning curve. Trump pulled out of Paris, everyone looked to China, and China said, wait a minute, like, we weren't ready for this. We didn't ever ask for this kind of position. And so hopefully, they'll learn quickly and can sort of take the lead on this for the rest of us.
Hi, I'm Reagan. I'm a political science student. I recognize that this question is a little bit of an oversimplification, but I'm curious nonetheless. I know that China has made massive investments in Africa in recent years, and also that Africa is projected to develop rapidly in coming years, which means a lot of motorcycles, a lot of cars, a lot of industrialization, and huge CO2 emissions. Do you feel like China's efforts to use more sustainable energy and to sort of facilitate that for the rest of the world will be able to balance that, or are those things going to sort of cancel each other out, this Chinese fuel development in Africa along with this Chinese progress in renewable energy?
I mean, it's hard to predict exactly how this is going to play out. I think you're exactly right. China has sort of seen Africa as hugely neglected by the West, and so it's pushed incredible investments in Africa. China has a lot of food security issues, and so China's essentially renting farmland around the world or buying farmland around the world and then shipping farmers to literally grow grain and then bring it back. And so it's doing that very aggressively in Africa. And so all of these initiatives in a way are helping Africa develop, but there's the kind of a pollution side or a carbon side to this. I'm hoping that China realizes, I mean, right now it's doing both. It's building solar plants and coal power plants in Africa, and it's not really picked a side, but it has the technologies to do either. And so I'm really hoping that it sort of switches over to the right side, because one of the things that China's also very good at is making kind of low-tech, cheap solutions that work in developing economies in a way that the rest of us don't. I'm German, everything's always over-engineered, super expensive. You can buy this like $2,000 dishwasher that, knows exactly what you ate and then adjusts it kind of. That's the German solution to climate change, right? Like, how do we make this more complicated? The Chinese solution is to kind of boil water and somehow it'll work, but we can sell it to you for a couple of bucks. And so they've done this, for instance, for water heaters, solar water heaters on the roof. China makes these very cheap solar water heaters. Everyone in China has one. You can see them on all of the roofs of high-rise buildings. I mean, this is the sort of technology that Africa can afford today, not the German solution to the problem, right? And so in many ways, there's a huge opportunity there, and I hope that they will take it.
My name is Robbie. I'm a political science student. You kind of addressed this in a previous question, but my question is, what, for the centralized government that does care about climate change, what is their incentive to even act? Like, are they concerned about global climate change, or do they just worry about pollution in their home country? Or out of the goodness of their hearts, do they really want to address this issue? You kind of mentioned how maybe they could become the producers of solar around the world, so maybe there's economic incentives, but what would you say are their main set of incentives to even do anything?
I think that there are different groups within the government, as I said, that have very different ideas about this. I had lunch with one of the climate negotiators for the Chinese government a couple of weeks ago before I had to leave, and she was saying that internally they also face this battle because the environmental ministry thinks climate change is a problem just as a problem, and we need to fix it because it's a global problem. And then to convince other parts of the government to come on board, they have to say, but investing in solar is also an energy security issue because it means we don't have to import as much oil if China has basically no domestic oil. So if we switch from regular cars to electric cars, we become a lot more self-sufficient. And then to the economics ministry, they say, well, but it's also kind of an export issue. If we grow these industries, we can make money by selling stuff abroad. And so I think the sort of collective decision to do something about this really is the sum of many different arguments that require kind of convincing. And so in many ways, it doesn't look so different from trying to get something passed through the Senate, right? You have to throw in some subsidies for Iowa and then convince. I mean, it's the same kind of horse trading that happens there within the government to try to kind of come up with the position. And so that's why I'm always saying you need to kind of analyze who the different players are, because you read in the paper, China has decided to do X on climate. It's really the sum of many of those decisions. But just to sum up, I think there is a pragmatic case for China to be made on taking this seriously because they're very exposed, they have a lot to gain economically, and they're also very dependent on energy imports. They're the biggest oil importer in the world and have been since the 90s. So I think the sum of those three reasons, I think, is sort of why they have an incentive to act.
Hello, my name is Joshua Sweeten. I'm majoring in civil and environmental engineering. My question is, as a U.S. citizen with little direct influence in China policymaking, what can I do to help China save the world on climate?
I mean, one of the things that we can save the world on climate, I think, is sort of trying to maintain an open trading system internationally. And so these current attempts to kind of slap tariffs on everything is not helpful because it's empowering exactly the kind of people in China that are saying this global system doesn't work for us and we should just dig oil out of the ground or coal in the case of China and become self-sufficient. So one way is to sort of just become politically active in the US and participate in these debates here. I think the US has a lot of influence over who wins within the Chinese government and which direction it takes over the long run. And I think the current approach has really emboldened the hardliners within the Chinese government that are not so interested in fixing climate. So that would be, I think, a way that local U.S. politics have a real impact on what happens in the rest of the world. Is that helpful, or were you looking for a more concrete?
That's actually very helpful. Hi, I'm Brent McConkey, and I'm studying international relations. And I'd just ask, how does the Chinese government manipulate the general public's perception of this problem, or how do they control how the people think about everything that's happening?
There's a lot of censorship, right? So if you try to go online in China, there's a huge sort of artificial intelligence apparatus that's basically set up to make sure that certain websites are blocked or that web traffic goes a certain way, that social media messages disappear. So there's been kind of a long-standing attempt to influence public discourse through technology, and China's gotten very good at it. And it's been very good at suppressing discussions about many environmental problems. There's a huge water pollution issue in China as well, because all of these factories are polluting. Again, you can imagine local governments have very little interest in enforcing environmental law if it means that their local factory is going to go out of business. So they sort of, close their eyes and close their ears and sort of ignore the problem. But you can't see water pollution in quite the same way. It's not really a visible problem. And so when this air pollution crisis hit, it really was the first environmental problem that they couldn't really deal with using those technologies because it was so visible to everyone. In 2012, I was living on the 38th floor in Beijing, and half the year you couldn't see the street from my apartment, right? And so initially the government was saying, well, it's really a haze problem. It's very foggy today. And then the American embassy in Beijing actually put a air pollution meter on the roof of the embassy and put this thing on the web where you could see what the actual pollution levels were every day, because the government was manipulating sort of the air pollution levels. And so that caused this big scandal because one night, so the limit of the system was like the measure is sort of a particulate measure, and it goes from like 0 to 500. 500 was the max. No one had ever reached 500. And so I think anything above 50 or 100 is really bad for your health. And so China was routinely hitting 400 and so on. And then and one night, it went above 500, and they had a new tech guy in the embassy who worked there who had taken the cap off. And so instead of displaying the measure, once it hit above 500, it was tweeting out the air pollution is crazy bad. And so crazy bad became this diplomatic incident between the US and the Chinese government, because now they were tweeting how bad the pollution was in Beijing. But so just sort of to say that this problem kind of took on a dimension that couldn't really be explained away or just suppressed in public discussion through social media, because people could see it every single day. Everyone was on wearing a mask on their way to work. And so I think that's really changed the broader public understanding on the linkages between kind of, coal power and climate and air pollution and cars. But it's also changed the government's attempt, because they have decided that they can't work against the public on environmental issues. And so they're now working with NGOs to actually publish more data, to give people more sort of transparent information about water pollution, air pollution, and so on. So there is a sort of shift, I think, currently undergoing. And the more successes the government can show, so air pollution has actually gotten better in Beijing over the last couple of years, the more I think those forces are also encouraged to make better decisions about these things. But yeah, crazy bad really was a turning point in U.S.-China relations on the environment.
My name's Lexanne Climbs. I'm an environmental science major, and I was just wondering, I saw that one of their goals was to have like 300 nuclear power plants worth of hydroelectric energy. And I was just wondering how far along they've gone in that, because that also impacts other countries that those rivers flow through if they're damming those areas.
Yeah, so China is building a lot of hydro plants along the Mekong River, which is a big sort of diplomatic mess in a way. So the Mekong basically runs from southern China to Vietnam. And so China is building these plants. You have to run. So China is building these plants along its part of the river, but is now also investing in some of the upstream countries to build power plants in Cambodia, for instance, and Laos, that are then exporting hydropower back to China. And the problem with these plants is that they control the water flow, and also they keep the sediments in the river in these lakes, and the sort of artificial lakes that are created as a result. And so Vietnam, on the end of the river, is now getting less water and also less sediment, so they have erosion. And so the Mekong Delta is sort of slowly sinking into the ocean at the moment. And so the hydro thing is really, we count it as renewable, but it's sort of highly problematic, because a lot of it has these consequences. China has this, in Germany, all of the government officials are teachers. I think in the US, they're all lawyers, and then in China, they're all engineers. And so the engineers have this incredible faith that technology can solve all of those problems. So I took my students on this trip down the Mekong River from Tibet, basically, to Vietnam, and we were interviewing these Chinese government officials about fish, for instance, because there's like hundreds of dams now that they've built. How do the fish get back up? And they're like, that's fine. We built fish elevators. We can have, we can drive the fish up. They have all of these technical solutions. But it's a very sort of dystopian future, and I don't know if it really actually works. And I think, again, it's local governments making these decisions in order to push growth over everything else.
Hi, I'm Camille Krieger. I am an open major. And I was just wondering your perspective with the virus that is now encompassing a lot of China. How does their goals for cleaner energy and less air pollution, do you think, play into the spreading of that virus?
I think the virus is maybe another test of this previous system where you're hiding a lot of the information. And it's, again, also the local governments kind of screwing this up, to be honest, right? The first case in Wuhan was in December 1st. They didn't really talk about it until the end of December. Then everyone was lying and saying that it really doesn't have human-to-human transmission. But you can see how the incentives that I just outlined for you are exactly at play here, right? Because Wuhan was thinking, what happens to foreign investment? Do we have to shut down the city? What are the kind of economic consequences of acting on this? And so they basically kept it hidden. And as a result, we might sort of now dip into a global recession because the local mayor in Wuhan was worried about his promotion next year. And so, you can see how this is very similar to the climate problem. I think that the Corona situation has taken on such urgency and kind of global importance. I think Xi Jinping is under a lot of pressure right now because he sort of is, the guy, so he's responsible for everything that happens. So I'm hoping that this actually will push the whole system more in a direction that will also help with all these other issues because in some ways we need to decouple good governance at the local level from this, relentless pressure to grow the economy that is creating a lot of these bad outcomes.
Howdy. My name is Nathaniel Nelson. I'm a mechanical engineering major. And not to be too Malthusian, China has the one-child policy, or had it, sorry. And I'm just curious about the interaction between like GDP per capita and consumption per capita and immigration and their overall population and how that affects climate and Chinese policy.
To sort of brief everyone, so China had this one-child policy for the longest time because there were real concerns about population growth, and China was already hitting over 1 billion people, and so basically you could only have one child with pretty draconian enforcement. If both the parents were only children, you could have two, and so that sort of maybe 10 years ago, the first generation was old enough where it was basically only children having then 2 kids. And now it's being loosened a little bit because they have this incredibly aging population. And so that comes with, again, economic consequences, right? Who's going to take care of the old people if there's no young people, and who's going to fuel consumer demand if the population declines? And so it's loosening up a bit. I think the idea is to kind of keep it stable where it is right now. And because they've been so drastic in the past, they have a little wiggle room at the moment. On climate, part of the thing is that China's per capita emissions are still very low. There's just a lot of Chinese people. I think it's a quarter of US per capita emissions. And so, even though it looks like it's a big chunk of the global problem, it's also a big chunk of the global population. And that's usually China's argument in these global negotiations where they're saying, like, you all have these 6,000 square foot homes and you drive a Ford 150, and now you're coming to tell us that we have to cut our emissions even though we don't really heat our apartments in the winter and we're taking public transit. And so I think that's a fair point, right? It's a hard one to argue, but that sort of goes back to earlier points. That's why I think we need to create economic incentives for China to participate, because if we say, okay, so we get that this isn't fair, but if you do that and we buy your solar panels, then maybe we can have a deal. That would be a way to address, I think, some of this imbalance. And we'll have to kind of cut our emissions too, eventually.
Hi, my name is Stephanie Ashby. I'm in computer engineering. I was wondering about, you talked a lot about solar and wind. What's China's feeling towards like nuclear power?
Yeah, it's super gung-ho towards nuclear power until the Fukushima accident in Japan. I think China was building something like 80 or 90 nuclear power plants when the rest of the world, I think, currently is building 3. And a lot of the international companies, so Westinghouse and sort of the French nuclear conglomerates that have built plants are that's their only market now, and they're working with Chinese partners. After Fukushima, I think it sort of was put on hold a little bit, and it's warming back up. It's still part of the official plans. What it's a little unclear to me is that in the rest of the world, building nuclear has become incredibly expensive, and so basically a lot of projects have been stopped because they've overrun. Sort of the cost overruns have just been incredible. And so the sort of $1 million question here is if China manages to build these plants within budget and kind of maybe apply some of its ability to cut costs and other technologies to the nuclear sector, then I think it'll be a big part of the Chinese system going forward. And that's great for climate, right? It's non-polluting, non-carbon polluting. Once we have figured out the storage issue of all the spent fuel, that's good to go. But it's a big chunk, and they've managed to get all the technology globally because the Germans shut down their nuclear program, and so Siemens had all these technologies for nuclear reactors that they basically gave to their Chinese partners because they weren't being used in Germany anymore.
Thank you.
If you join me in thanking Professor Nahm one more time.